And welcome back to Fishing College. This is Ramey Outdoors, and today we're talking about all these wacky symbols right behind me on any kind of fishing reel box you've ever seen. This is going to apply to both bait casters, low profile, and round profile, as well as spinning reels. So let's go ahead and get into it. Here's your arbitrary reminder to go ahead and like and subscribe for more. The first thing that you're going to see right here is this little gear symbol and a 6.6:1. But what does that actually mean? All that means is that that is the reel's gear ratio. So breaking that down even further, that means that for every singular turn of the handle, that reel or spool is going to spin 6.6 times. Let me show you. Right here we have a Fluger Try-On, and the handle is right here. So we're going to count it out. 1 full rotation, 2 full rotations, 3 full rotations, 4 full rotation, 5 full rotation, and then part of 1. That is because this is a 5.2:1 gear ratio. Why does this matter for fishing? Basically, all this means is per full revolution of that handle, that is how much line you are going to be taking in at any given time. And this can be really important for certain techniques. But why shouldn't I just go for a really high gear ratio every single time if I can just winch those fish in really quickly? Well, there's two big reasons for that. The first one is that typically high gear ratio reels are going to lack torque. Another reason is that a lot of those times, these baits, like a deep diving crankbait, need time for their action to get all the way down to their depth. So if you're going to be using a deep diving crankbait, especially on a bait caster, you might want to go for something like a 5.5:1 or a 6.0:1 gear ratio. Whereas if you're using a topwater frog and you need to take in line and take slack in really quickly, you might want to use a higher gear ratio like a 7.8:1 or higher. This next one says 8 kilograms or 18 pounds. But what does that mean? What that means is the amount of drag that the actual reel has. But what is drag? What drag is the amount of force that is applied to the line as it is coming out with the bail or the spool locked down. So what this means is that this Shimano Curado 300 HG has a maximum of 18 pounds of force that can be applied to the actual line as it is coming out of the spool. So why is this important? So what drag is actually used for is while you are fighting a very large fish and you don't want to break off, you are extending that fight and allowing for it to take line out while you are still applying pressure to it. So I'm going to showcase what that looks like right here. So this is what the spool looks like open, just so I can show you that it's closed. And I can pull line out of the spool while the bail is still closed. Now, if I am looking at the reel, turning it clockwise, this little tiny dial right here, that is going to be tightening it. So what does tightening it do? What tightening it does is that it makes it harder for line to be pulled out. Turning it counterclockwise is going to lessen the drag. And what that does is it makes it easier for line to come out. But what does this matter? Why shouldn't I just keep my drag set all the way down every single time? Well, that's kind of a good point. Why shouldn't you? Reason one, if you're using lighter tackle. So say that you're using 8-pound test line and you're fighting a fish that is pulling really hard. If you have that drag cranked all the way down, it is just going to snap you off completely. So having your drag set right before that breaking point, or a little bit more than that, can actually allow you to elongate that fight with that fish and actually land it. Another reason is if you're using a bait like a crankbait, along with the parabolic curve of the actual rod, you don't want to be applying too much force, because if you're applying too much force, what that can do is actually rip this hook through or out of the mouth. If you're using a thicker gauge hook, like on a frog or on a jig, this may not be as much of an issue, so you can actually put your drag a little bit tighter. But with something like a crankbait or a jerkbait, you don't want to have it cranked all the way down. And finally, another really big reason, and this doesn't apply necessarily as much to bass fishing, but say that you're fighting a really big fish that likes to take long runs, for example, like a tuna. Having your drag set to where it can wear itself out before landing is really important because these are really big, strong fish. So allowing for it to take those runs and allowing for it to wear itself out actually makes it a lot easier on the angler instead of just, cranking and cranking and cranking, trying to fight a full strength fish. Now, this middle one might seem a little bit self-explanatory to some of you, but it actually does matter to a degree. So why should you go for a heavier reel or a lighter reel? Well, a heavier reel is going to be able to handle heavier fish, typically. This isn't always cut and dry, obviously, because if you build just a really, really big reel out of really heavy material that isn't very durable, you get the idea. But it can also end up being a little bit more sturdy. Now, why should you go for a lighter reel? A lighter reel might be a little bit more comfortable to carry, it might be a little bit more ergonomic, things like that. So yes, it is a little bit self-explanatory, but I just wanted to go ahead and include that in the video, just so you guys can understand it a little bit. Next, let's talk about that 5+1 right over there. What is that exactly? Well, that's real ball bearings. And is that just advertising mumbo jumbo? Yes and no. And let's talk about that. So ultimately, what ball bearings come down to in the quality of a reel is the actual quality of the ball bearings around the reel, and also the build quality of the reel itself. So if you have a reel that is like 13+1 ball bearings, and it is $30, and they're using really cheap ball bearings, that's not going to be a very effective use of those ball bearings. And it's also not going to be a very smooth casting or effective reel. Now, say that you have a $400 reel that only has 6 ball bearings. If those ball bearings are very high quality and made out of a very good material with a very high quality reel built around it, then that is going to operate 100 times, thousands, 100,000 times better than that 13+1 ball bearing reel. Typically, good ball bearings in a well-made reel, they're not going to corrode nearly as quickly. They're going to have what is called good shielding, which is basically keeping any kind of gunk out of those ball bearings, and basically just making it easier to cast, easier to reel, things like that. And oftentimes what you're going to notice with cheaper reels with bad shielding is that you cast them a couple times, they feel pretty good, but when you start actually using it catching fish for a long time, in quote from Sport Fishing Mag, it's going to feel like a coffee grinder. Ultimately, I could go on a lot longer about ball bearings and how the intricacies of them really matter, but this is an intro video and I'm not wanting to make this too complicated. So let's move on to the next thing. Let's talk about that bad boy all the way down there on the far right. What does that mean? Well, that is how much line is being pulled in per 360 degrees of that handle. So this kind of goes into conjunction with that gear ratio a little bit. They're kind of cousins, if you will. So in this exact reel, it is 35 inches per 360 degrees. So that is 35 inches of line is being pulled in. This is going to be affected by two things. First off is going to be spool size. Second is going to be your gear ratio. So for example, if you have something like an 8.5:1 gear ratio with a really small spool, you may not be pulling in quite as much line as something that has an 8.5:1 gear ratio with a pretty big spool. So when you kind of play around with this a little bit, you can kind of understand just how much this is actually getting affected. And this can really change out your retrieval speed, especially whenever you're going something like a topwater frog or a walking bait where you have to really pull that line in quickly sometimes. So what the heck are all these weird numbers right here? Well, that is talking about spool capacity in terms of your fishing line. So why does this actually matter? And what does it mean? What this is talking about is the pound test, the type of the line, and also how much you can also put on there. So you're seeing nylon mono, and that is talking about nylon fishing line or monofilament. And so you would see 12-pound test mono, you can put 230 yards of that on there. Versus Power Pro, which is a type of braid, you can put 40-pound test, 195 yards of that. Well, what if I wanted to use, 30-pound mono? I don't see that on the chart. And you actually bring up a really good point. Well, there are a couple of online calculators that you can use to where you can plug in any kind of published line capacities. So for example, what you would do is you would plug in 12-pound mono and 230 yards of that, and then it will find you new line capacities and how much you can actually put on there at that given test. But why is this important? This is important because for a reel to actually operate as it's intended to, it needs to be as close to that capacity as possible. If you've ever held a reel or used a reel that has way too much line on it, it's generally either going to bird's nest like crazy, it's going to create a bunch of wind knots, line is going to jump off the spool, and it's kind of feel like there's a bunch of sand in the gears. And oftentimes that's what happens when there's too much line on the spool. The inverse for this is also really, really important. If a reel doesn't have enough line on the actual spool, what that can do is that can really affect how much line is being pulled in per turn. And it can also affect any kind of backing. You can get your line slipping. It can cause a number of issues. So that's why it's really important to use not only the correct size of line, the correct amount, but also maintaining the correct amount. That's why it's really important whenever you have barely any line left to go ahead and respool, or what you can do is you can use the line that's currently on there, create a leader knot, and use that as backing, and just apply more line. And I'll do a video on that eventually. I really hope that helps. And if you guys have any other kind of videos that you guys want me to make in the Fishing College series, go ahead and leave that down in the comments down below, and I can get around to making videos on those relatively soon. Remember to go ahead and like and subscribe. And as per usual, have fun catching fish, people. Peace.